So I think we all know by now that 0% AI are absolutely useless when it comes to the F1 game. I mean, just have a look at this. And if you didn't know, I'm also pretty useless at the F1 game, but not quite as bad as the difficulty I'm up against today. And for that exact reason, in this video, I'm going to level the playing field and try and beat 0% AI without any assists on a controller. So at first, I tried to complete the challenge around Monza, but honestly, I could never get the first corner right. So after about an hour of crashing, I messaged my good friend Sugah Ali, who you might have seen in this video, and asked him what track he would recommend to complete the challenge. And he replied with an absolutely genius idea. So of course, it wouldn't be a 0% AI video if I also wasn't doing a last to first challenge, which was definitely going to make this video harder. And for some reason, I thought trying to complete this challenge in only 5 laps would be pretty easy considering the difficulty I was up against. However, as you're about to find out, this was definitely not easy. I hadn't even made an overtake before turn 1, which wasn't ideal, so I decided to set myself up for a nice exit out of the first corner, and it worked perfectly. Going up the hill, I made my first overtake of the race on Logan Sargent, and then going through Massenet after, I made a little bit of contact with Esteban Ocon, but eventually I managed to get past him. So far I'd made 2 overtakes, and next up was Lance Stroll. I planned to go up the inside of him at Mirabeau, which I eventually did, but only after I slammed into the back of him, which to be fair was probably my fault. We are now coming into the slowest corner in Formula 1, and as you can probably imagine, it's even slower against 0% AI. And because of this, I slowly went up the inside of Nico Hülkenberg, which continued into the corner after the hairpin. I eventually managed to get around the outside of him, and now I was up to P16. So I was pretty happy with this start, as I had already made 4 overtakes, which was mathematically all I needed to make per lap, and there were still 3 overtaking spots left in the lap. And as you just saw, halfway through the tunnel was one of these overtaking spots, as the AI simply had 0 straight line speed. We are now going through the Nouvelle Chicane, which I honestly found so difficult, and for this exact reason I completely sacked off trying to take it properly, and to be honest, I've got no idea how I didn't get a warning here. Looking back, I'm genuinely buzzing I didn't get a warning there, because I absolutely needed them when it came to the final lap. Anyway, next up was Daniel Ricciardo, and I was planning a move on him up the inside into the final corner. So as you just saw, I thought about going for an infamous Rascasse dive bomb up the inside of Daniel Ricciardo, but in the end I decided to go around the outside of him. This move continued into the final corner, where I got a much better exit and I made my way into P14. So I think that's been a pretty good first lap, and I didn't plan to stop here. Next up was Kevin Magnussen, and because of no ABS, I was always prioritising exits, which worked out perfectly here, and I made another pretty simple overtake. After this, I had a moment to think, and it was at this point where I started to believe that this challenge was definitely possible. Even though I was driving pretty horribly with no racing line or ABS, I was still making overtakes, which for me was more than enough. Anyways, that's enough of my waffle. I then made a relatively easy overtake up the inside of Zhou Guanyu, and Mirabeau was definitely becoming one of my favourite overtaking spots. Next up was Valtteri Bottas, and even though I did make the overtake, I kind of banged him out of the way in the process, and I'm not going to lie, I got a little bit scared that I was going to crash with the wall on the inside, and this probably would have given me massive damage. I actually made the corner at the Nouvelle Chicane this time, which was progress, and going through the end of Sector 2 and the start of Sector 3, I was honestly just trying to relearn the track without using the racing line. This was holding me back so much as I never made progress through this section of corners. Anyway, next up was Sergio Perez, and I wanted to make a similar move to what I had made on Daniel Ricciardo on the previous lap. Annoyingly, I had a pretty bad lock up into the final couple of corners, which meant that I couldn't get around him there, and I definitely gave Valtteri Bottas wing damage. However, that did not matter. I then got past Checo on the straight, and after this I set the fastest lap of the race. Honestly, I was starting to get really confident at this point that I would complete the challenge, as this lap had still been far from perfect. I almost crashed into the wall at turn 1 trying to get past Alex Albon, but thankfully I didn't, and I ended up squeezing past him going up the hill, which put me into P9. I was so happy with this, as I now had 2.5 laps to make 8 overtakes, which I knew was very possible. Next up was Lando Norris, and I knew that I wanted to make a move into Mirabeau. I dove up his inside and got ahead of him. However, trying to turn in, I locked the front tyres, which wasn't ideal, and then trying to get the throttle down, I almost spun out, which allowed Lando to get back past me. This was really frustrating, as I now knew that I was letting the leaders get away, and it was going to take even longer to catch up to them. I almost tried to go for a move up the inside of him at Portier, but I decided to be patient, and this was definitely the right move. I eventually flew past Lando going through the tunnel, and I was finally up to P8 after being behind him for almost a full sector. Next up was George Russell, but first I had to navigate the Nouvelle Chicane, and this was a bit of a disaster. Even though I completely cut the corner, I somehow managed to avoid a warning, which was useful, but looking back I can see how much I rely on the racing line and ABS, because the Nouvelle Chicane makes me look like a complete noob. We are now going through the swimming pool section, and to be fair, this was probably the best I took it throughout the entire race. I genuinely got pretty close to the walls, and for once through this section I felt like I was being held up by the AI, not the other way round. Anyway, through Raskas I had a little bit of a disaster. I briefly dropped down to neutral, which isn't the smartest thing to do, and then I narrowly avoided the wall on the exit of the corner, but sadly this meant that I wouldn't be able to get past George Russell on the straight. So what I decided to do was once again prioritise the exit. Coming into the first corner I broke a little bit early and I got some really nice rotation, and once again I made a move up the hill. Going through Massenet I took a really wide line to try and get as close as possible to Oscar, and into Casino I dived up his inside, but he just about got around me. We then competed on the exit of the corner, but eventually I of course managed to get past him into Mirabeau, and I was now into the top 6. Next up was Carlos Sainz, but first of all I made such a silly mistake. Going through 7 I turned in a little bit too much, which gave me my first warning of the race, and this was so frustrating. This was because I was trying to tactically save them for the final lap when I knew that I might have to break a couple rules. However, there's nothing I can do about that now, and coming into the tunnel I realised that I was quite a way back from Carlos Sainz. This meant that I was probably going to have to make a dive bomb into my weakest corner on the track. So I used a little bit of battery to get closer to Carlos, and thankfully I then made the overtake. Somehow this was probably the best I took the chicane, because I actually managed to gain a full 7/10 on Charles Leclerc from the exit of the corner all the way up to Tabac. And then going through Tabac I closed all the way up to Charles, and I knew that if I wanted any chance of winning this race I'd have to make an overtake soon. So I dove up his inside, and I want to apologise for this absolute abomination of an overtake, because there's no way that's not an illegal move. However, if I am going to win this race I'm definitely going to need a little bit of luck, and that was definitely lucky. And now we are going through the final corner onto the final lap, and this is where for me the pressure started to kick in. I had to make 2 overtakes very quickly because Max Verstappen was definitely getting away. First up was Pierre Gasly, and I just about avoided his early braking into turn 1, and I made my first move. This put me up into the podium positions. Next up was Fernando Alonso, but first of all I had to close down a massive 1.5 second gap. It was at this point where I realised that my lack of ERS was really going to hurt my chances of winning this race, because by the top of the hill I was out of battery. I had managed to close all the way up to Fernando through Mirabeau, and this is where I decided to make my move. Going into the hairpin I dove up his inside and kind of barged him out of the way, but either way I was eventually going to get past him. I was now up to P2, 2.5 seconds behind Max Verstappen with 2 sectors to go. So going through Portier I gained almost 2/10, which was massive, and then on the exit I gained almost a second, which I carried all the way to the Nouvelle chicane. So do you remember me telling you about banking warnings? Well, this is where I knew that I would have to use one. So coming into the chicane I was 1.3 seconds away from Max Verstappen, and by just cutting a little bit of it off I managed to gain almost 3/10 up to Tabac, and this was huge. And then going through Tabac I didn't really gain any time, but as you can see here from the alternate angle I had magically appeared right on the back of Verstappen. Absolutely no idea how that has happened, and I was just behind him coming into the final 3 corners. I almost lost the car before Raskas, however I then had my best run through there ever. I went from 7/10 back to 2/10 back, and I could set myself up for a perfect final corner. And that's exactly what I did. I then flew past Max Verstappen on the straight before the finish line to complete the challenge, and probably the closest ever finish I've had in a 0% AI video. Thank you all so much for watching and the recent support. By the way, if you have any video ideas please put them in the comments section below.